Hello there, Physically Debunked here. First of all, a big thanks to everyone who's subscribed and is supporting this channel. At the moment, we're nearly at 700 subscribers, which is fantastic. The more of you there are, the more I feel obliged to grow this channel and push it forward. So if you like what I do, then please do subscribe and keep this channel growing. Now to get to the subject of this video. I've had quite a few requests to address this particular argument properly. So here we go. In this video, I'll be discussing a version of the contingency argument for God's existence, proposed by Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. I've already made a video on the contingency argument before, where I ranted at Cameron Bertuzzi's presentation of it, but that was at quite a colloquial, popular level. Here, I'll be delving into a full exposition of the argument, as I did with the Kalam. Now, there are lots of different contingency arguments, so I may not be talking about precisely the one you have in mind. Many versions of the contingency argument have two different stages to them. The first stage is usually what is referred to as the contingency argument, and usually argues not for the existence of the theistic God, but for the existence of a necessary entity of some kind, an entity that cannot fail to exist and explains its own existence. The second stage then goes on to argue that this necessary entity should possess all the properties of the theistic God, and so should be identified with him. This is just like how the Kalam works. The first stage of the Kalam doesn't argue for the existence of God, rather it argues that the universe must have had a cause for its existence. It's the second stage which then argues that this cause must be the God of theism. Since the second stage of these arguments argue more directly for the existence of God, I certainly intend to address them in a future video. The reason I haven't talked about them much before is that I think they're far weaker than the first stages of these arguments. But anyway, the version of the contingency argument I'll be addressing in this video is one which actually doesn't have a second stage. Last year, on Capturing Christianity, Rasmussen presented his modal argument from contingency, which argues directly for the existence of God. Here is the argument as it appeared in the video, which I've linked in the description below. Premise 1. The universe can, consistent with reason, have an explanation. Premise 2. The universe cannot, consistent with reason, be explained solely in terms of non-maximally great things. Conclusion 1. Therefore, the universe can be explained in terms of God. Conclusion 2. Therefore, God can exist. Premise 3. God can't exist unless God exists in all possible worlds. Conclusion 3. Therefore, God exists in all possible worlds, including ours. The purpose of this video is to discuss the first premise, that the universe can have an explanation. But before I jump into that, let's get a feel for the argument as a whole. The first two premises in this argument are the ones doing the most work. Their aim is to establish that it's possible that the universe has an explanation for its existence, and that this explanation cannot be just in terms of contingent or non-maximally great things. It's these two premises that I think are the most problematic. The first conclusion, that the universe can be explained in terms of God, doesn't actually follow from the premises unless God is defined as the unique maximally great being. So a lot can be said about this first conclusion as well. Beyond that, the rest of the argument is pretty sound. The second conclusion follows very simply from the first, since it's only possible for God to be an explanation if it's possible for God to exist. The third premise is very standard modal logic, so long as God is defined as a necessary being. And then the conclusion follows from all of the above. So if the conclusion of this argument is false, it's most likely that we're going to find problems in the first three lines. So let's get to it. First up is the first premise, the so-called principle of possible explanation. Is this premise plausible? Is it plausible that the universe can have an explanation? There are a few things to unpack here, but on the whole, I think this is quite a plausible premise. I certainly find it more reasonable than either of the premises in the Kalam. What's quite powerful about this premise is the fact that it doesn't require the universe to actually have an explanation. All this premise requires is that it's possible for the universe to have an explanation. Some atheists followed the lead of Bertrand Russell, who argued that the existence of our universe could be a brute fact. The universe is just there, and that's that. There is nothing that explains the universe's existence. But even if that is the case, this doesn't necessarily imply that this first premise is false. It's not saying that the universe does have an explanation, only that it could possibly have one. In the language of possible worlds, the actual world may not have an explanation, but so long as you believe it's not impossible for the universe to have an explanation, that there is a possible world in which our universe does have one, then this premise holds. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the terms in this premise. What does it mean by universe? In the video, Rasmussen clarifies that by universe, he means the totality of all non-maximally great things. What are non-maximally great things? In Rasmussen's view, God is the only maximally great thing, so by universe, he just means everything except God. But this seems a bit unhelpful, possibly even question-begging, to define non-maximally great things as everything but God. Even worse, some people may disagree that greatness is something that's well defined at all. Is there an objective measure of greatness such that the property maximally great actually applies to something? I'm very doubtful of this. Is there a different way we can understand non-maximally great things that won't immediately put people off this argument? When other contingency arguments argue for the existence of a necessary entity, they do so by claiming that our universe is full of contingent things, whose existence requires explanation. A contingent thing is something that could fail to exist. It doesn't exist in all possible worlds. A more neutral way of interpreting universe in this argument, then, could be the totality of all contingent things. Another way we could interpret universe is as the totality of physical reality. I think these alternative interpretations of universe capture the essence of Rasmussen's interpretation, but without invoking a vague category like greatness. If we interpret universe in either of these ways, is it plausible that such a thing as the totality of physical or contingent reality can have an explanation? One possible problem with this premise is that its plausibility will depend on whether you already believe there's something more than physical reality or not. If you believe that there might be more to reality than physical or contingent things, then you'll probably find this premise quite plausible, since you'll believe that it is possible for there to be non-physical or necessary entities which exist externally to the physical totality and can explain its existence. For a theist, this would be God, but there are alternatives. If you think abstract objects such as mathematical ones exist, then these things might explain the existence of the physical or contingent world. But now let's suppose that you don't believe in the existence of anything non-physical, and that physical reality, however large it may be, is all there is. Will the first premise be plausible to you? Possibly not. There are two options on this view. If physical reality is all there is, then there is nothing external to explain its existence. One might posit that there is an explanation for the existence of physical reality, but this explanation must be self-contained somehow, either by allowing explanations to be circular, which is controversial, or by saying that the existence of physical reality is necessary. It explains itself. In either of these cases, there is an explanation of the universe's existence, so the first premise would hold. The alternative is to argue that it isn't consistent with reason for physical reality to have an explanation. It isn't possible for anything to explain the existence of physical reality, since there isn't anything that can be external to it. It's not that the universe explains its own existence. There is no such thing as an explanation for the universe at all. It seems perfectly possible to take this stance, and if you do, then the first premise of the modal contingency argument fails. Whether you think this position is plausible or not, however, is up to you. In my own opinion, I don't think it's inconceivable that the universe could lack an explanation for its existence, but I find it more plausible that the totality of physical reality does have an explanation of some kind. Either its existence is necessary and it explains itself, or there are things beyond physical reality that exist necessarily and so explain both the existence of physical reality and themselves. Something like mathematics or logical laws, perhaps. We could also take a look at what is meant by explanation in the first premise. There are multiple ways that something can have an explanation. Perhaps the explanation is a causal one, and we're saying that it's possible for something to cause the existence of the universe. Perhaps the explanation is a gnomic one, that there's some law of nature that entails the existence of the universe. Or perhaps the explanation is a logical one, that something external to the universe logically entails its existence. If you think that any one of these kinds of explanation could possibly apply to the universe, then the premise holds. But maybe, seeing all of these options for the meaning of explanation makes you more doubtful that the universe can be explained. What law of nature could exist externally to the universe and explain its existence? What cause could exist externally to the universe? Can there be anything external to the universe that logically entails its existence? Perhaps all of these forms of explanation don't apply to the universe as a whole. If none of these kinds of explanation makes sense when applied to the universe, then it might be the case that it's not possible at all for there to be an explanation for the universe, and hence the first premise fails. To conclude, there are some possible reasons to doubt that this first premise is true. If the universe is all there is, then does it make sense for there to be an explanation for it? If you think causation is something that only makes sense within the universe, then maybe you'll find it plausible that explanation is something that only makes sense within the universe too, and that the universe as a whole can't have one. For my part, I'm not convinced. I think it's pretty plausible that the universe can have an explanation of some kind. The alternative just isn't very persuasive. I certainly don't think that there's a single, external, maximally great entity that explains the universe, but I think it's implausible that it's impossible for the universe to have any explanation. I think that either the universe exists necessarily, and so explains its own existence, like God is supposed to, or that there are necessary entities, like mathematical ones, that exist in all possible worlds and ground the existence of everything else. Or perhaps every possible world exists, and so our own universe exists simply because it's possible. In any case, I don't think there's a God, but I do think that there is an explanation for the existence of physical reality, or at least that it's possible for there to be one. Overall then, I'd give this premise a solid 8 out of 10. I think it's extremely plausible, and I'd be more willing to accept it than deny it. But I also recognise that concepts such as explanation may simply not apply to something as exotic as the whole universe, so there is room to doubt this premise. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned for the next video where I'll be addressing the second premise of this argument.